Hello everyone, welcome back to A Fictional Escapist. My name is Kris, and today I am joined by two wonderful human beings for the Queer Corner, episode number 4, all about discovering and exploring identities through escapism. Let's get right into it. We'll start with introductions. We'll go with Steve and Connor. Let us know who you are, pronouns all about you.
Awesome.
Do you want to go first or should I?
I don't know. You can go first.
All right, cool. I'm Connor Caplan. I'm a queer autistic quadruplet. I write SFF, weird genre blendy stuff that's just very traditional sort of narrative structure mixed with the weirdest shit you've ever seen thrown in there. That's all I have written down for that. If you want to go.
Yeah. This is Dante. His pronouns are he, him.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
He's the one writing all the books, right?
Yes, actually. Yeah. I'm just the puppet, really.
Yeah.
He needs a human face to be,
Right.
presentable to human writers.
Of course.
Yes. He's actually very derpy. But anyway, he's about to start knocking things down, so I had to remove him.
Yeah.
You will probably
just cat things.
Yeah, just cat things. Being chaotic, getting his fur in my mouth. So my name is Steve Westenra, and I am a trans writer from Canada. Originally by way of the UK, I guess. I grew up in Newfoundland. I'm also neurodivergent, and I write horror and fantasy and basically anything weird. I tend to live in a kind of ambiguous genre space where I'm kind of blending lots of different kinds of genres, I suppose. And I think that was the equivalent of what you said, maybe.
Yeah, no, I like that. We're checking off a lot of the same boxes. We're off to a great start already.
I think people know who I am, but for anyone who doesn't, I am a bisexual trans man who lives in Australia and has written nothing at this point. There's a work in progress, but it's coming. Cool. I've got a bunch of questions for you both today, and we will work through them, some specifically related to your work, so your books, and some just sort of more general as people within the LGBTQIA+ community to chat through and maybe offer some insight to other people out there who may be going through their own journeys. So the first one I want to talk about is self-discovery through media when you were younger, or when you started sort of questioning or playing around with identity in different ways that you present yourself. So when did you first see yourself represented in film or TV or books, no matter how young that was, and what did it mean to you at the time? We'll start with Steve this time and go down and around.
Cool. I find this kind of question really hard to answer for me in a lot of ways, because I think because of the age I am, the demographic. So I was born in 1986, which makes me, I think, 38. I'm pretty sure I'm 38. But I could be wrong, so feel free to correct me in the comments or something, because I can't do math, because I'm queer. So, because of that, there weren't a lot of characters that were kind of exactly, the identities that I am, or any of that kind of stuff in a lot of the media that I consumed. I think a lot of queer people, who are of a certain age, or I sort of more so identified with queer coded characters. And a lot of so I'm also an academic, and I work on monsters and the monstrous, that stuff. A lot of what I research is actually sort of queer identification with monsters. And a lot of that's coming from stuff that I myself did as a child. So often I identified with kind of really oddball characters from these strange sorts of movies and TV shows. So Hoggle from Labyrinth, or Schmendrick the Magician from The Last Unicorn as a child. These kinds of somewhat goofy, derpy but misunderstood characters who have kind of an element of the tragic about them. I often, when I watch Disney movies, would identify with the villains, those kinds of characters. Jafar, Beetlejuice, Jack Skellington, all of these kinds of, they're all outsider sorts of figures in a way. So that's really kind of, I think, where a lot of my identification happened as a young person. I will say, There was when Yuri on Ice came out. Have you guys seen Yuri on Ice, the anime?
Months ago.
Months ago. Okay, so that's
Yeah.
pretty recent.
Oh
What
god, no, this was back in last winter. That was more than a few months ago. Holy shit. Oh,
about-
time is
What
weird.
is time? What is time?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about you, Kris? Have you seen that one?
No, I'm not an anime fan.
That's
Sorry,
fine.
everyone.
Yeah, that's fair. I don't watch a lot anymore. I did when I was younger. This is an exception. So I watched the Yuri on Ice. For anyone who doesn't know, is a gay figure skating anime that came out like quite a while ago now. It's not recent anymore, really. But
2016, I think.
yeah, something like that. Yeah, which apparently is almost 10 years ago now, and that is like
Jesus.
it's not good. It doesn't bode well for future, changes in time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in that one, I think like it was one of the first times like I remember seeing a relationship quite like that portrayed in that medium in this way. And so I think for me, like, and I know my partner, we had this kind of like, excitement about it. It felt fresh and new, and there was a little bit of a thrill about it. I'd loved also anime Revolutionary Girl Utena as a teenager. There's a lot of stuff like that that was kind of formative. But even Yuri on Ice, like all of these things, they kind of like skirt around identity a little bit because they have to play it safe to some degree. And so there's a little bit of that as well. But these are the kinds of like figures that I found myself gravitating toward a lot of the time. Yeah. Connor,
This
it's
is
your turn.
also a weird question for me to be able to answer. Probably for a different way. Because up until like very, very recently, I mostly just thought of myself as like a straight white man. And so basically, most of my childhood and adolescence was just sort of like, all right, I'm doing great. This is wonderful. I'm just kind of everywhere. I can see myself in anything. And it wasn't until I think 2019ish that I'd been kind of thinking about it for like since like 2012, 2013, but it was only 2019 when I started seriously sort of grappling with like, oh, I think this happened because I had a conversation with a friend, I think around that age when I was trying to figure out what my sexuality was, and at one point I said the phrase where it's like, I think I'm straight, but like I would suck a dick or something, and they were like, bro, what the fuck are you talking about? I don't think you can be straight. And I was like, what do you mean?
You're basically the main character from one of my books.
Yeah, it was the double. As soon as I saw that double take, I was like, oh, I've like horribly miscalculated, huh? It was like, but like that was, I think I was put off from identifying with that for a long time because when I was in high school, I think like Tumblr was getting big around that age, and that was where I was spending a lot of my time on social media. And because of that, I grew up surrounded by fandom culture, and a lot of the people around me sort of treated queer men as more like a commodity than like people. And so that really put me off from being like, well, I don't want to end up like that. Like, all right, cool. I'll just like not think about this. And I don't think it was until I found what was it, Robin Hobb's first trilogy, I think, was the first thing that sort of like gave me the tool set to sort of conceptualize it, because I think there's a thing in the third book in that trilogy with the Fool, where someone goes up to Fitz and is like, the Fool's a woman. And he's like, what the fuck are you talking about? And I think he confronts the Fool on this, and the Fool is just like, who fucking cares? It doesn't matter. And I was like, that kind of apathy towards like gender and expectations was sort of the first sort of moment where I was just sort of like, oh, okay, this is actually something that I can really relate to, and let's unpack why I relate to this. And it was just sort of off and away from there.
It's such a fun question, and this was hard for me to answer as well. Like, I gave it to you two before I looked at the question and had to like look at myself to answer it myself. Because yeah, and it's because I'm a stuffer downer. If I feel things and I don't know what they mean, I'm just going to shove that down and figure it out at a later point. So my trans identity, I was 26 when I had a whole shit moment, and 27 when I sort of started the medical transition. But I think that like there's a lot of signs, and I definitely knew things, but there was a lot of traumatic experiences in my past which sort of blocked my brain from allowing that to be part of my journey at the time. So I didn't really see myself a lot. And then when I, identifying as a female at the time at 14, realized I was attracted to women, I stuffed that down. And then when I got to uni or college, depending on what you call it, I was like, you know what? I am obviously attracted to women. As someone identifying as a woman, let's start exploring this. But then nothing felt quite right at the same time. But I threw myself so heavily into a lesbian identity and into sapphic media and sapphic books, but nothing really came across as me until and the trans thing still didn't twig for many years later. But when I read Tipping the Velvet by Sarah Waters, it's a sapphic love story told in 3 parts, basically exploring um, the the traumatic love or whatever it is, the first love, and then like the real love, like that trifecta. And there's the middle part of the book where this character Nan King dresses up as a boy and starts cruising in gay areas to offer sexual favors for money. And I was like, oh, I like dressing up as a boy. And that makes more sense to me in my brain than anything else that I have come across. And then Nan is picked up by this dominatrix-like character because she enjoys having Nan dress up as a boy and being that masculine presence in her home, and starts like showing her off and stuff. And I was like, this makes more sense to me than anything that I've read, and I don't know what that means, so I'm going to shove that down where it belongs, in the I don't want to deal with it hole. That we all have. I'm sure everyone has got one of those. And then as it started to sort of twig a little bit later, I found this actor, Elliot Fletcher, who I saw in Faking It. He's a trans male actor, and I still had no fucking idea what transgender meant, but he kept talking about it in his early roles. So the Faking It was like a queer normative teen. They were in Austin. They were just sort of exploring identities, and a gay man is interested in him, and he goes, "Hey, I just have to tell you I'm transgender." And I'm like, "That's weird. What does that mean?" And then stuff that back down in the hole. But this guy kept turning up in shit that I was watching. I was like, "What is this guy? Like, why do I keep gravitating towards this man and what he's acting in?" So then I saw him in a show called The Fosters, which was written by Peter Page, who played Emmett in the US version of Queer as Folk. If anyone has seen that, big part of my I'm not really gay, but I like men doing stuff phase. And he was in that again, and again he explained that he was transgender, and I'm like, still don't really know what that means. But that was the first place where I saw top surgery being celebrated, and this trans character had surgery and was showing off their chest, and it was a cause for celebration. And then this guy showed up again after I started questioning my own gender journey in Shameless and talking about it again. I was like, oh, right. That makes more sense. But it was probably those 2 characters, as I was coming to terms with my own journey, that really made the headway for me. It's just interesting that we've all sort of come across it in different ways. Sorry, Connor.
No, I wanted to let you know, I don't think I've ever told you this, but for the first, like, I think month and a half that I was just, after I became aware that you were like someone in the community, I don't think I knew you were trans. And like, I think this happened around the same time as that thing with the epic indie guy. And so that throughout that whole drama, anytime I saw one of your tweets, I was just like, oh wow, we love an ally.
Yeah, no, I actually had my first foray into YouTube was a trans channel. So
That's
you've got
incredible.
like way back from when like I'm baby faced and squeaky voiced, right until I think before I started BookTube, I basically stopped the trans channel and jumped into BookTube. I was like,
Oh man.
this isn't my whole identity anymore, and we'll get to that when we come to sort of
Yeah.
advice. But I still really love reading, and I just lost all of that, and so I just jumped ship to book stuff.
I like that.
All right.
Yeah.
So, talking about characters from our past, I guess as more we get older and we become adults, and Steve, I'm guessing we probably had quite a similar experience because we did this older, when our cognitive function was fully formed. And that's one of the things that when I went through, so in Queensland you have to go through and get signed off by 2 or 3 doctors to be able to get on testosterone. And one of the things that the therapist was like, "Oh, you're 25, so you've thought about this." And I was like, "I'm a Virgo, so I've thought about this." It doesn't have anything to do with age. My star sign dictates I've tried to tick every box that I can before getting to this point. But I think there's a difference perhaps in experience when you are an adult going through it versus when you are someone who is younger. And so I'm curious as to what characters, now we've settled into these identities, do you identify with now, and how important are they to your journey and how it continues?
Yeah, I like that's given me a lot to think about, honestly. And so did what you just said. Like that to me was sort of like, oh, like I should have answered the question like that and talked a little bit more about, I guess, like what it was like being kind of a trans person as a teen. Because, I never I like, aside from when I was like really quite young, I like past a certain point I didn't identify as a woman. But even once I kind of had an idea that like transness was a thing and it existed, I still didn't like to, call myself that. Like I rather wanted to be, just identified as a man, like without any kind of like asterisk or anything like that. Like that's what I wanted. And partly that probably was because to some degree that was the media that, I was seeing. Um, and I think too, when I was younger, like I had both a more settled identity and a less settled identity than I do now. By which I mean, like the kinds of things that tended to bother me in terms of transphobic responses to my identity as a young person. They aren't necessarily the kinds of things that would bother me now. Like somebody misgendering me back then would have just like, I'd get this tightness in my chest, I'd feel like really bad, and just sort of this sense of shame and just like, dysphoria about my body and things like that. Whereas now I'm kind of like, well, it just happens. Like, they made a mistake, that's fine. Like, and I think some of that is, again, because I feel both more settled and less settled. By which I mean, I feel sort of like, with age, I've become more confident in just sort of my place in the world. And also that, sometimes people do make mistakes and it's not coming from a bad place. But also less settled in that, like my conception of sort of male and female got really problematized in my 20s. And so, like none of this seems particularly rigid to me anymore. Whereas I do think when you're a teenager, there's something about being a teenager, you want to cling to some kind of like, life raft of identity that will sort of give you some answers, or it will give you some kind of sense of security. And of course, no teenager is secure, right? Because they're all hormonal and like angry or angsty all the time. So, but as an adult, hopefully that's a bit less so. And I have managed not to answer the question at all. But one of the things I was going to say, my answer written on my piece of paper is I don't really identify with characters. Like, I'm terrible at this. But like, I do, in that characters are a really big, important driving force for me in terms of like why I really love a certain book, or why I really love a certain movie or show or whatever it is. But I think because I never really like saw myself as such growing up, like I grew up with an ability rather to attach to different aspects of a character's personality. And I do think I picked up a lot on like neurodivergence in characters, or a vague general sense of queerness to a particular character. But I also think like a big part of it for me is I like discovering and learning to identify with characters who I don't share pieces of my identity with. Like to me, that's really enjoyable to kind of see the commonality, but also to kind of recognize difference and learn something about myself, but also about the world and about other people. So, I did mention Yuri on Ice as sort of like, I guess, a moment seeing queer characters, on screen who were kind of being celebrated by the medium in which they were in a really mainstream context. But I don't know that I necessarily identified particularly with either character. You know, a lot of the same characters that I identified with as a child, like Hoggle and Schmendrick the Magician, are honestly the same ones I identify with now, and that I think about fondly. But sort of add to them, I guess, like characters that I met in my adulthood, like which just ended up being a list of characters I just like who don't quite fit in places, like Brienne of Tarth in A Song of Ice and Fire was a big one for me, and also Jaime Lannister, Tyrion Lannister. I wrote down Stannis just to piss people off because I like Stannis.
Thank you for having the correct opinion.
Yeah, thank you. Stannis is a complex.
I haven't read it or watched it. I'm a terrible fantasy fan.
It's okay. I gave up on the Brandon Sanderson series one book in, so you know I'm also a traitor to like the fantasy community, and like yeah, same with Wheel of Time too. I gave up one book in, so everyone can just hate me.
I got 3 books into Wheel of Time before I called it quits.
I am 3 books in, but I fucking hate Rand. I just cannot stand the dude.
I just remember me really boring. Man. Yeah, really generic.
His whole arc in book 2 really threw me off for a while. I was like, dude, just talk to like a pretty girl like a person, please. I'm begging you.
Just treat them as a human.
Right. Like stop like being weird about the fact that you can see her legs. I swear to God.
To be fair to Rand, from what I hear, that's kind of how Robert Jordan treats them too, though. So maybe he should be weird about them.
Oh man. Oh. Yeah. I hope he doesn't become self-aware. I'm trapped in the mind of a horny author.
A horny undead author, I guess.
Oh my God. I like that framing of it. Yeah. All dead authors are technically zombies. Yeah.
Exactly.
Like
yeah. Because their work lives on after them, so it's like this weird.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, revenant
echo. They're like mental zombies that live in your brain. I like that.
It's the immortality. We crave it. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah. You get it. Is it my turn to answer? Or did it? Okay, I wanted to make sure I wasn't interrupting you.
I didn't properly answer, but like I think I went on long enough that it probably counts. Is it okay?
All about the tangents here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Beat us with a stick or something virtually.
That makes sense. I wrote down like a bunch of queer characters that made me feel seen. Most of them are probably going to be like recent. But my answer is probably very similar in that like I identify with a number of different characters across fiction. Stannis is a great example of like the dude has trouble seeing shades of gray, and it's like, wow, I deeply relate to that. Love that. Just really tempting to adhere to a very absolute sort of moral standard. And so there's stuff like that that's always sort of been very sort of grounding for me, just to be able to find people like that, even if there's not necessarily queerness involved. And then also it's really, really interesting. If there is a character who I don't quite understand or who's like just outside of my ability to like relate to them, that can almost sometimes be more engaging for me, where it's just sort of like I really need to work to understand where you're coming from, and that fascinates me. That isn't even just a character thing, that's just like a person thing. There are people who I deeply despise who just like I am fascinated by them. I just want to like I am just constantly thinking about these people. It's just like, how does your brain work? How does this is this sort of like thought process consistent for you? Do you notice this thing that's happening? And it's just like that's just constantly that kind of stuff just constantly intrigues me. And where the queer characters necessarily sort of come in is often seeing them can kind of help me sort of understand things about queerness or about myself, as sort of like sometimes these characters can sort of be representative of a larger set of ideas that I'm trying to engage with. And if I find one at the right time, it can really help me get some sort of breakthrough in an idea I'm trying to conceptualize. I think the first time that happened to me was reading Swords Point by Ellen Kushner. And that was, I remember the first time I read that, I was immediately taken by the idea of like, they switched so fast from like endearingly domestic to like absolutely ruthless. And that sort of that switch between the two sides of them, where it's like you could go from cozy fantasy to Game of Thrones within the turn of a page, was like really fascinating to me, because I hadn't seen a ton of queerness up to that point. That wasn't just trying to do one thing or the other. It was either like very sort of I don't know, I don't want to call it simplistic, but it's just sort of like a sort of like baby's first queer character kind of a thing. It was like it's like that kind of writing, where it's like and or it would be like someone who's trying to write someone who's incidentally gay in a sort of grim dark story. And that was the first time I had seen that kind of queerness that was trying to just sort of do something that was more multifaceted. That really sort of helped me envision that there isn't necessarily one mode of queerness, because that was something I struggled with, especially throughout my early 20s. It was this idea, like, part of the reason it was so hard to conceptualize myself as queer is because it was very easy to cling to more rigid sense of gender roles, where it's like, oh, I can't do that, I'm a man. It's like, wait, if you actually think about that, that doesn't actually make a ton of sense. There's nothing to do with having a penis that means you can't like try whatever thing that it is that you're sort of put off by. It's like, that's not how that works. And so encountering a lot of that sort of really helped me. I think the only other things that I wrote down was I really like Crystal Matar's queer characters, just in general, because like Tashway and Ishmael especially are just some of my favorite like queer characters, just full stop. Like I can't think of any queer characters who are like better written, just from, like, their queerness informs who they are so completely. But they're also so multifaceted in that they can be like very hyper masculine in some senses, but also extremely sensitive in ways that I've rarely seen men written to be. And that was just really, really refreshing to see. It was like such a breath of fresh air. And the other one I wrote down was the characters in the Locked Tomb series is just sort of like it was the first time I had seen I think there's a quote from Tam Samir saying that she was writing about, I don't know if I'm remembering this quote right, but it was like the inherent eroticism that exists between any women who share proximity for more than 5 seconds. It's just, or something of that nature. That was the first time I was like, I've seen that happen. I've seen just two women existing together, and then suddenly it's just like, wait, is this sapphic? What's happening? You two haven't met. And there's just a weird energy happening there. It's just sort of like, I'd never seen that put to a page so completely, in a way that was just sort of like, oh, I see how this is happening. And that was also like a very fun sort of like lightning rod moment for me, of like, oh, this is actually encapsulating an experience that I have not really experienced for obvious reasons, but have seen happen with other people. That's it. That's everything.
It's interesting listening to both of your experiences, because this is one I also had trouble answering, because I don't tend to gravitate towards characters like me. I already have one of me. I don't need any more of that when I'm looking for queer characters. And I find it difficult to relate to queer male characters, just because I feel like I'm the worst trans dude on the planet and the worst like queer dude on the planet, because I feel like I don't fit into any of the, for lack of a better term, boxes within these communities. So, having this trans identity and wanting to be, so very out of the female box and into the male box without any in between. Some of my favorite queer characters are non-binary characters, and that is because that is an identity I did not understand at all at the time when I was going through transition. So my favorite non-binary character is a character called Alarin from the series The Tar Child by R.J. Barker. And at no point is this person gendered, but they do unravel their story as the series goes on. I thought that was so beautiful to explain this identity that people didn't necessarily understand, but they just let be, because people are people and they deserve to be treated as such. For me, sort of identifying now, and it's interesting because from the outside world, Rachel and I are in a heteronormative relationship. I pass pretty well now as just a white dude, albeit a very short white dude, that people wouldn't look at us and go, gay, like when we're walking down the street. But I naturally gravitate towards gay male characters in books, because that's an identity that, as a female, I wouldn't allow myself to be attracted to men. I was like, no, that feels disingenuous to who I am as a person. I don't understand that. And it wasn't until I transitioned that I was like, oh no, men are hot. Like, until like it got a few years in and I started being more comfortable in myself. So the two that come up for me, and one is really recent, like I just finished the book, but the first is going to be a character called Evermere from A Taste of Golden Iron. This is a male slow burn political romance, like fantasy romance, and he is just so regimented and disciplined. Like, this guy's got the biggest stick up his ass, and I was like, yes, I relate to you, my dude. But he is no nonsense. He loves rules. He doesn't really give any sort of outward show of a queer identity. He just happens to fall in love with this person who is very unlike him, who he thinks is a complete like slice of nonsense in his life, but he just can't help gravitating towards this person. And it's here I tell you that Rachel and I did not like each other for 2 years before we ended up like just getting married. So it's very reminiscent of my own relationship and my own marriage. We both thought each other were assholes. We were like, this bitch, I don't want to hang out. And then we just kept gravitating towards one another and then suddenly married, you know? So, and it's been great. Like, but we had to go through that to get to this point. And the one that I recently read was another male romance, which is not a genre I tend to gravitate towards, but I've picked up a couple and really enjoyed them. And that was A Strange and Stubborn Endurance, written by a trans author called Foz Meadows. And in this book, the main character, Velison, again, sort of softer, needs a lot of TLC. I didn't relate to that person, but the love interest, Kay, who needed to be the one to be very patient and very nurturing and be that strong force, I related to him quite heavily. And I think that comes from a place of, you know, speaking about my own relationship, Rachel and I both came from places of trauma within different relationships, and we both needed a lot of patience when it came to building a life together. It was a very slow process, very much filled with building blocks of, why are you treating me nicely? Because I don't understand that. And I don't know what to do with it. But then someone having the patience to be like, that's okay. I'm going to keep treating you this way. And hopefully you will see that this is okay. And we both had to do that for each other. And it was that aspect more than a queer aspect that pulled me into this particular character. But those are the two that I really can think of. I don't identify a whole lot like you guys with other characters that are in books, just elements of different characters. So that being said, I think all of us are writing. Connor, you've got a book out. Steve, you've got a couple of books out. Actually, Connor, you've got 2 books out. I think I have the other one. I've read The Fall Is All There Is. I have the other one, but I haven't read it.
Yeah, I pulled the Sword in the Street recently because I want to revise it before I offer it for money again. Because I wrote it at 23, and I was just sort of like, I should probably do better than that. That was good for getting my foot in the door, but I'd want to revise it before it's on sale again.
23-year-old author though.
Yeah, no, that was amazing. That part was fun.
And now you must be at least 25, so.
Oh, I turned 28 next week, actually. Next Monday.
Happy birthday in
spring
advance.
Chicken.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because, you know, now being in our identities and having those come through in our works in different ways. I've just booked a developmental editor. It's happening at some point next year. So
fantastic.
I'll talk about mine later. But how do you play with your identity in your writing? How do you explore gender and sexuality in your works, knowing not to give too much away because there are specific questions coming up?
Do you want to start?
That was for everyone question. I know there's one about for Connor later, so I was like, this is the Connor question, but it's not the Connor question.
Not yet. Next though.
I also wanted to kind of like, you know, I keep going back to things you've said. So apologies, but just like what you said about kind of like stick in the mud characters super resonated for me, and that reminded me of like another Alexandra Rowland book. The Taste of Golden Iron is Alexandra Rowland. That I just really liked this character in oh dear, I can't remember what it's called now. No, but it's a really good book. Anyway, but he's like a crotchety old man, and like I had to confirm with Alexandra Rowland that he was queer, and they were like, yes. And in some way, it's not really described basically. And I was like, cool. But he's like not a very nice person. Does all these shitty things, like objectively in real life, like, you know, you ought not to like this person. But like, I think those kinds of like, even though I have these kinds of ambiguous ideas about things where I don't like things, I don't think things in reality often have definitive answers and stuff. I'm also bizarrely, in a contradictory way, really rigid about things. Like it takes a long time for me, if something changes suddenly, it takes a long time for me, or an amount of time for me to process that it's changed. And it's not that I dislike the change. And people will think that I dislike the change. I'm having a negative reaction to it, but it's like my brain short circuits and I just need to like
This is the most autistic thing I've ever heard.
my mom and my sister think that like our whole family is autistic, so like maybe
I wouldn't be surprised based on what you just said, honestly.
Yeah, I do have OCD as well, and I suspect I probably have ADHD, but like I don't know.
Yeah,
like it's just a cocktail of things. So
yeah, we've got all the alphabet disorders.
Yeah, exactly, all the comorbid alphabet disorders.
Yeah.
Yeah. Someone recently online was calling like all us queer horror people like the evil alphabet squad or something recently. So
I like that.
Yeah. So maybe it fits. Okay. Yeah. So my books, without I try not to go into too many spoilers and stuff. Like I guess like identity, I think, whether or not we're talking about it rigidly, is always going to be a part of anybody's writing. So whenever you're coming up with characters, even if you don't think that you're doing it, just by coming up with their backstory and their context and where they grew up, you know, all of this stuff, you're coming up to some degree with like the ingredients that make up the recipe of their identity. This metaphor is getting bad. This is something I didn't plan, you can tell. So I think that's always going to be there. However, I do think, so in the past when I would write, it would often be kind of like subconscious that I would kind of think about or write various different kinds of queer identities into my characters. A lot of them are a bit more sort of subtle, and I'll kind of wait a little bit later to talk about that because I know Chris's question is sort of along those lines a little bit. But as I went back, and so for example, my two books are The Wings of Ashtaroth, which is this kind of sprawling epic fantasy. I conceived of it when I was like 13 or 14. I finally wrote it when I was in my late 20s, and then I went back again to edit it in my sort of mid 30s and started serializing it online before publishing it as like a complete book. And I found as I was re-edited, every time I kind of like revisited the material, it got more queer and in an overt way. And that particularly happened this last time when I was revising it, where it became sort of really evident on a reread to me how much kind of like the story was about identity in all kinds of ways. And a lot of the queerness is sort of this rather ambiguous nature. So again, kind of characters who just don't quite fit into sort of a rigid gender binary. So, one of like the central characters are kind of this royal family, more or less. It's a big cast. There are people who aren't part of that family, but they're few and far between. And like there's a sister who, on the surface at least, she's straight and cisgender, but she wears men's clothing. She occupies a male social role in that she's like the head of their navy. She like fucks random dudes, has two kids, neither of whom have the same father, and no one knows who the father is because she just wanted to have kids and didn't want the dudes in her life. Like, so she's really kind of like breaking all of the rules of her, what her gender role ought to be in that particular society. And a lot of the characters are kind of doing that. And her sister is sort of this very kind of mousy, bookish woman who has had a marriage, and this is like minor spoilers, but it's early in the book, so hopefully it's okay. But just warning to anyone who hasn't read who might want to mute. But early in the book, her husband dies, And she decides to join like the like lesbian temple that everyone knows is the lesbian temple, but she's very kind of like almost like has this sort of I guess kind of a naive innocence to her a little bit. I think subconsciously she also knows it's the lesbian temple and is sort of like compelled for some nebulous reason, like that she doesn't really know, to go to that particular temple, and kind of goes there. And really, like, a lot of her storyline is about kind of discovering this thing about herself, finding community with these other women. She ends up in a relationship with a trans woman at that temple. But you know, in my other book, which is it okay for me to go on like this? Is that I'm not going on too long? Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. In my just making sure this is gonna get boring for people. In my other book, The Years While Tyler Kyle, which is the one that I have in Spiffbo this year, that's a queer horror comedy. You know, it says queer right on the tin, basically, when I'm sort of pitching it places as to what its genre is. And basically the premise is that this YouTuber, he's a cryptid investigator with his best friend from acting school. And he gets lured to an isolated island in the Canadian wilderness by a videotape of his presumed dead B-movie bombshell mother, who is based on Elvira. So already it's getting pretty gay up in here.
I'm already on board. No,
Yeah.
that's all you needed to say.
Yeah. So he gets lured there trying to investigate, you know, well, is she still alive, that kind of thing. And in the meantime, he's also fleeing his co-host, who he drunkenly made out with at an award show, and who is like supposedly straight, and they've had this kind of tiff about it. And when he gets to the island, he finds out like it was a former conversion camp that subsequently, you know, has turned into something else. And pretty much everyone on the island is queer in some way. And there also might be monsters in the woods that are trying to eat him. So,
That's incredible.
But yeah, it's a lot of things to be dealing with. You know, no one's stolen $4,000 from his bank account though, but maybe I'll put that in the next book.
Yeah.
Yeah, for anyone who doesn't know, this happened to me today, which they are aware of. So, you know, I think like one of the things that Tyler as a character kind of wrestles with, a lot of what you guys were saying, like you especially, Connor, like it sounded like you are Tyler in a way. Like the things that he finds frustrating about identity were kind of the same things that you find frustrating, in that like he very much doesn't want to be this kind of like sexual fantasy for other people. Basically, he doesn't want to be fetishized, and he's very conscious as a media personality that that's what's going to happen, right? Like it's like, you know, it's like he has a line in something where he's basically like, I don't want to be just uwu cute gay boys on demand kind of a thing.
I've had a number of women who do that to me, and usually the reaction is not pleasant.
Yeah. No. Yeah, exactly. Like it's, you know, it's not great, that sort of fetishistic kind of attitude that, like, again, you put it really well, like commodifies a person, right? Like, you know, it's not just about a quiet sexual fetish that you kind of go off and have on your own privately, which like, you know, people have, whatever. It's about sort of like you're then sort of imposing this on actual real people. That's the part that's bothersome. So he has a lot of like kind of like complex sort of like concerns about identity in that way, as well as sort of like very much is in the position of like, oh, actually, like I think I might like to give this guy a blowjob, and which more or less basically happens. Like he's at the beginning of the book, he gets there and he's kind of like, but I'm probably not gay, I guess. Like not that there's anything wrong with that, but like
I do feel called out.
Yeah, but I made out with my best friend, and also like, you know, was just about to jerk off thinking about us making out, and like, and he's like, well, okay, so I probably am like a little bit gay, or like he's actually bisexual, and which I am too. And then like he gets trashed and tries to give this elderly drag queen a blowjob in an alley, like in like the same night. And like
that's incredible. Oh, this is the best pitch.
This just shot to the top of my TBR. Like,
yeah, no, literally.
Thank you. He's very chaotic, like, yeah, like just like very big energy kind of person. But a lot of that book is about not wanting to be pigeonholed to some degree, or at least where it sort of like engages, I guess, with like gender and sexual identity and that sort of thing. I'd say the other thing in terms of sexuality that I really wanted to kind of address, which I think is sort of adjacent because it gets into sort of talking about kink and like that kink space, And
Wow,
the idea, sorry?
Oh, I said no, now I'm interested. I didn't think you're actually going to hear it.
Yeah. So just like, yeah, like the question of like aberrant sexuality, like, which of course queer sexuality has been considered aberrant and still is considered aberrant in a lot of contexts, right? So and especially in the context of the book, he's entered this community where it's a group of people whose aberrance has been particularly marked, right? Like they've been through sort of conversion therapy for the most part in some way or another. But there's also another character who I'm not going to name because it would get too spoilery, but there's a character who has uh, certain predilections and sexual preferences that are very much disturbing and grotesque to a lot of people. And there's a kind of like embedded shame that that character feels that is mirrored to, and like this is so vague, I'm sorry, that is mirrored to some extent in like Tyler's feelings as well as another third character's feelings. And so there's a lot I wanted to kind of explore there in terms of like, well, what is what does it mean to have an aberrant desire? You know, like what does shame do to kind of one's sexual you know, being? How does that impact us, and what are the negative kinds of repercussions of that? So you know, those are some of the things I guess I wanted to explore through those works. Yeah, that was a long-winded answer. I'm sorry.
No, that was great.
That was awesome.
Thank you. Connor?
A cat showing up just when it's my time to answer. I figured out I was capable of being attracted to men through writing my debut. That was mostly like I wrote it in the tail end of 2019, around the time when I was actually like starting to sort of grapple with that. I wasn't sure if I was for a long time, because anytime I was reading a lot of MM content, a lot of it was either the thing I was talking about earlier, but like baby's first gay character kind of a thing. Sanitized feels like a mean way of putting it, but like I hope it at least sort of clarifies the kind of thing I'm talking about. Or it would be very, very, very sort of really, really raunchy masculine men kind of a thing, which was also not really my thing. Or it would involve sort of activities that were also being like, I had a long in the polar opposite end of like I'd suck a dick, so but I'm not gay. The polar opposite was like, well, I can't be gay because like I don't want to I have no interest in anal. that was the other sort of like thing that I thought was like a requirement for a long time. And that was sort of the thing that I was seeing in a lot of anything that involved like anything with male content. And then eventually I sort of got to where it was like, well, what if I could control for those variables by just writing something myself? And that was my attempt to sort of do that. And it sort of turned into a reskinning of Swordspoint almost, that was really preoccupied with the sort of weird pressure marginalized men tend to face, where it's like this idea of like you are marginalized but you can get access to like power or validation by clinging to these very like patriarchal sort of ideas of what it is to be a man. And so it's sort of like that was a lot of what the book was meditating on. And generally that is the sort of thing that preoccupies the kinds of things I write about. You see that showing up in The Fall Is All There Is as well. It's just sort of like I'm generally fascinated by the bizarre rituals men tend to create to sort of protect their sense of masculinity. There's this idea that like a lot of them seem to have, where it's like people will respect you if you behave in a very violent, volatile manner. And that shows up a lot with Peter. Especially who it was very difficult to actually write that because he's not as self-aware as he thinks he is. But so he thinks of himself as a very enlightened person who would not stoop to that, but is generally constantly stooping to that sort of thing of like generally trying to be volatile in the hopes that will get him what he wants. And that's sort of there's a sort of a code switching thing that I tried to bake into his personality of like his approach to maleness and masculinity is often very dependent on like who he's in the room with and what version of it that he wants to sort of play into. It's very much sort of like turning yourself into the sort of like what was the word I used earlier? The commodity, in order to try and get something you want out of a situation. That's generally the aspect of gender that I can speak to the most, because I tried to cling to a lot of that when I was younger, and now I'm sort of like am very, very disinterested in that, but still sort of fascinated with it. Like this isn't technically about books, but I think it's a good example of like the kind of things that sort of preoccupy me. Is like early last year, I spent like 5 months living with a former associate of the Hells Angels who had spent 20 years in federal prison. And he was like my landlord for 5 months. And it was just sort of the most fascinating sort of glimpse into just like the most macho mind imaginable. Where he was constantly making things like needlessly difficult for himself, or attacking my sense of masculinity because I wasn't doing things. I wasn't sort of engaging with his sort of atrophied, myopic idea of what a man is. And that just confused and infuriated him constantly. And this all came to a head at one point when I was putting dishes in a dishwasher, and he tried to tell me that I was lazy and effeminate for not washing them by hand. And out of just sort of pure bewilderment, I was like, John, you hire a maid to come clean your house every other weekend. Like, what are you talking about? And it was just that was the sort of like, that's the kind of thing where it's just sort of like, I think about this man all the time, because I'm just so curious how he got to be the way that he is. Just generally like very, very just sort of narrow-minded worldview. And this weird just sort of idea of how he has to be in the world because of his gender is just, that's constantly fascinating and intriguing me. And I often, the stuff I write sort of explores that sort of side of masculinity.
I try to unpack that a lot in my own life, like thinking about that all the time. Like, why do people feel that they have to act certain ways, and why do we care? Like, because I feel like people don't actually care, yet we have so much stock in the way that, or they have on the way they identify, they have to attack other people for doing it differently. It's like,
that guy's so obviously like, he so obviously thinks about it all the time. Like the degree to which he's like poking at you about it is like, holy shit, like this guy is like literally thinking while he's doing his dishes, like I am doing the manly dishes.
No, exactly.
Is that itself is such a mindfuck too, because it's like, then you've got this other stereotype that like dudes are lazy and would use the dishwasher, women, like it's like like dueling ideas of gross, like
no one can win the dishwasher argument.
Oh my god,
that's exactly it. It's fascinating to me. I started like dressing in like in a sort of more like gender non-conforming way towards the tail end of that, just to see how he'd react, just to fuck with him a little bit, because I was just sort of like, how are you the way that you are, and how are you going to react if I start leaning into this sort of thing that you're doing here? If I start just poking in a way that you can't call me out on. It was such a fascinating experience. And I'm constantly sort of thinking about the way that these kinds of people interact with the world.
It just makes you think about why things are gendered. Like, why do things have to be masculine or feminine, and why can't they just be things? Like, it's kind of wild. It's a spiral I go down all the time. Usually with a glass of whiskey in hand. And then Rachel's like, this again, leaves.
I relate to that. My fiance is constantly like, I'll be talking about this, and she was like, I think he might just be overthinking
it. There's so much to think about, though.
Right.
As a teenage trans man, like I went through this whole like it was probably 10-year period where it was just like, I leaned really hard into misogyny. Even though most of my friends were women, because it was like, well, the more douchey I act, the more everyone's gonna be like, yeah, that's a man. Basically, it was so
God.
I had this whole period when I started transitioning where I refused to smile. in photos, I would have to frown because that made me look more manly. So, like,
I did
when I
this
was doing
exact
the
thing in my
whole
early
first
20s.
year on testosterone, I'm not smiling in anything. I'm just frowning in every single photo, being like, why? Why is that a thing?
Oh my god,
And then I look at them now and I just laugh at them because I was an idiot. Like,
it's incredible.
but yeah,
I
I relate to leaning into the misogyny though, like having to try and hyper masculinize.
It's a bad time. It's not a good thing, and like, but I still like, you know, I see people doing it. Like you see young trans people kind of doing it, and there's this sort of
yeah.
little awkwardness, and like my heart goes out to them. Like, you know, it's just like you see, you're trying to fit yourself into a
Oh
box
no,
because
dude.
you know you don't belong in this other box that someone else put you in. But that doesn't mean you have to go, you know, stand in, you know, the box that's, you know, up to your knees in shit or whatever. Like another bad metaphor, but
Yeah.
anyway,
Go and buy those cargo
you
pants.
don't have to go stand in. Yeah, you don't have to go sit in the litter box. Like, don't do that.
Oh, man.
It's interesting because the book that I'm writing now and the one that I'm looking at sort of releasing and its series is my transition story.
Oh, I
None of
like
the
that.
characters in it are trans or overtly queer in any way. It's not written in a way that's overt that this is what it
Yeah.
is, but to me, I know that this is what it is. And it's a new adult sci-fi, so it does read a little bit younger because, which is a throwaway to, even though I was 27, I felt like a fucking teenager going through all of that again. And it felt so ridiculous to have those emotions be super heightened going through puberty a second time as someone who was almost 30, but not being able to control it at all. And just having to be like, I have to be ridiculous right now. I understand it's ridiculous. I cannot stop this train that I am currently on. And it's the characters, like I said, they're not trans themselves, but our main players, each and every one of them have to go through some form of transformation. And so it deals with a lot of hybrids. Think of this book as like Animorphs cross Orphan Black. So
Oh,
we're dealing
damn.
with sort of animal hybrids and DNA and genetic cloning and all that sort of stuff. So some of them are fully into their transition and some of them are just starting out. And we've got all different stages. We meet people who haven't started, who are questioning what's going to happen to them. And there's a whole lot of movement within that. And there's a few throwaways in there in my own writing, like the main character, Caleb, is very stereotypically, I feel like, in this community, turns into a wolf. But when he comes back from the shift, he gets really excited because he has some more body hair. And like there's little throwaways like that, which I think that will be a nod to people who have transitioned or are going through transition. They'll be like, I see what you did there, but it's not going to be overly overt to people who aren't necessarily looking for that. And then in the acknowledgements, it'll be like, bam, like this is what this story is.
Oh, I like that.
Or
That's so
like
clever.
the about me section, which is really going to piss off people who don't know and hate the LGBTQIA plus community. If any of
Oh,
them
I
ever
love
pick it up,
that.
and they'll be like, I hate this book. You read it, so who cares? Like,
It's giving me
at
Matrix
the end of
vibes. Matrix vibes, the Wachowski sisters.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
Oh my god, yes.
But I want to get a little bit more specific with both of you about your work. So the first question I've got is for you, Connor, about Peter in particular. Peter has to be one of my favorite queer characters that I've read. Now, I read The Legacy of the Brightwash, and then I backed it up with The Fall Is All There Is. And Tashaway and Peter were just these unapologetic characters. So I find Peter to be such an unapologetic character who is himself. There isn't any question sort of about him, even though he might be questioning himself, like outwardly. He isn't. I think it was such a strong character and he absolutely owned who he was. So what was that like for you to write a character like this and release them out into the world?
Oh, it was terrifying. Absolutely. It was I'm trying to figure out how to really describe it. I was trying to remove the parentheticals off of every sort of personality trait that had ever interested me. I'd been writing Peter since I think when I was 16 or 17 or so. It started as like he's been like showing up in various sort of stories that I'm writing that are like completely disconnected to the whole world and everything. He was initially a weird Percy Jackson ripoff in this weird sort of like King Arthur descendants in suburbia squabbling over PTA meetings, kind of a thing. It was a weird middle grade thing. And it was and then I never finished that story, but like the bones of the basic ideas of the kinds of stuff that I was grappling with sort of showed up there, and then he would sort of wander into various other stories. And I kept sort of going back to him because like his whole personality, it's always been like he's very easy for me to write, just because for some reason or another I seem pretty inclined towards writing very neurotic characters who are kind of stuck in a state of heightened emotional intensity for some reason. It could be any reason, really. I have no clue. I don't know why it's so easy for me. But the actual writing of it was a fairly smooth experience, but it was terrifying to actually put it out because I wanted him to be like unapologetic in terms of like he's constantly a mess. He's constantly horny, even when he shouldn't be. He's constantly just sort of like trying to like looking for ways to pick a fight, even that he knows he shouldn't be doing. Does not have a filter or anything, and it's just sort of it was like very difficult to grapple with. Like I had no idea how that would be received. And it was and that there was a temptation constantly to sort of dial it back. I was constantly wondering if I was going too far. Luckily I had like the only reason I managed to go as far as I did was because I had a decent sort of support system around me, people being like, no, just keep leaning into it. And I was like, okay, cool. And a lot of it from there was just sort of I have a penchant for connecting ideas in the way that a detective does with like the lines of string on a conspiracy board. And so that sort of really came in handy for just sort of trying to sort of conceptualize the way that he is in this world. And I think part of the reason I wrote him to be as queer as he was and just was because I had very recently sort of come out the other side of processing all of that. And I wanted to write someone who could be unapologetic about a lot of that in a way that I had not been able to until very recently. And that was a really good sort of, that helped me get through a lot of the stuff that I was sort of questioning about and trying to figure out. Weirdly, it's a lot easier to write Peter's attraction to men than it is to women. I did not expect that, but the first read through, I got feedback of like, you either need to make him gay or you need to completely rewrite his attraction to women because he comes off like he's in the closet and just won't admit it to himself. Because anytime I write attraction to women, I'm like, oh god, I'm gonna end up on one of those men write women sort of things. There's gonna be a screenshot somewhere, and someone's gonna be like, look at this piece of shit. How dare he? It's constantly on my mind anytime I have to write him being horny for anyone who is not a man. But then if it's a man, I'm just like going with the raunchiest shit because I don't even need to worry about it because I'm just, for some reason it just does not click in the same way because there's no boards of men writing men. There's no things that I have to worry about like the reception to that. It's just I can just do, like, I feel, because like queer communities I think are just generally tend to be more accepting of things like that kind of raunchiness, that kind of kink that Peter seems to be into. So that was a lot easier. So I ended up having a lot more trouble writing his straight relationships, if anything, because that I was I had much more difficult time of assessing and second guessing myself, weirdly. That's everything.
There's boobs breasting boobily. Is that what you're confessing?
Yeah, no, I'm constantly worried about that, like that exact thing. Because I literally had this experience, I think a few weeks ago or something, of I was going outside for some, like with my fiance, and she was coming down the stairs, and I was like, sometimes you just breast boobily.
I said the same thing to Rachel. She was like, what are you even talking about? I was like, I don't know. Sometimes they just breast boobily, and I don't know who else to say it.
Sometimes it's just got that pendulum action,
Pendulum.
Oh, it's just literally, it's that exact sort of this, and it's like I wanted to write that in a way that felt honest. Yeah, and I wanted to write it in a way that felt horny, where it's like someone's gonna read that and be like, "Oh, wow," and like that. Like I wanted that reaction, but it was so hard to sort of like. Because the other thing was like, and this is something I'm definitely struggling with in book 2 as well. For the just to be clear, I'm expecting I'll probably get some notes at some point about this, because I'm always like, Peter is constantly being horny with everyone, irrespective of whether or not it's appropriate in the context. But also, that's gonna hit different if it's like a man doing that to a woman in a point where like this character needs to be threatening, and he's just being like, well, she's threatening to hurt me, like, what do you want from me? Of course that's going to turn me on. Like, that's gonna have a different energy if it's like some like him doing that with another man versus him doing it with like some woman who's like 5 foot nothing and wearing a lot of pink or whatever the fuck. Or it's just sort of like, that's why it's a lot easier to get stuck in my head about it and be like, well, it would feel dishonest to like not do that at all. But it also is like, I don't want to lean too hard into that, because then it starts feeling like too misogynistic, you know?
For sure. I think like one of the things though is because you're writing, like I think one of the complaints that a lot of people have in the like men writing women stuff is because they're trying to write women's POVs, and like the women's
Yeah.
POVs on their own bodies are like really strange. Like they're always thinking about their boobs all the time or whatever. But if you're writing a horny dude, it's like, boobs are nice. Like I'm horny about the boobs is like pretty normal. Like it's not.
Yeah.
I think that's an honest way of talking about sexuality or whatever. But again, it, like you say, it does. You do want to not like it depends how you want Peter to come off as well, right? So,
yeah. There's that too. Yeah. Yeah. So it was very easy to write, but like
in the world.
What was that?
Sorry, no, you go, Connor.
No, I was gonna say he's largely easy to write, but the trouble comes in like trying to predict, like trying to figure out like how are people going to react to this thing he's doing, and is that reaction worth sort of reconsidering how I'm coming at this?
Yeah, for sure. I think we're in like just an interesting time in the world as well, where we sort of need to, and it's not necessarily a bad thing that we need to make sure we're respecting everyone as they deserve to be treated, but it can make writing those scenes hard. I've purposefully not written any spicy scenes at all, because I feel like I'm so vanilla and they would be very boring for anyone who read them. So I want to jump across to Steve, and we've spoken previously about how your characters don't necessarily share your trans identity out in the world, but the characters are still somewhat extensions of your soul. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how you write these characters with intention as a trans person.
Yeah, definitely. So this was some of the stuff that I was holding off in terms of talking about Ashtaroth in particular, like the Wings of Ashtaroth. Like, I wrote this blog post quite a while back talking about queerness in my books, and it sort of turned into a whole like essay basically about like my childhood and growing up queer and kind of what that meant at a certain point in time, where like it was kind of pre-internet largely, like there wasn't so much access to information in the way that people have it now, so it was quite hard to kind of know things about your identity or about the broader community if you didn't have access to that, especially in like a small town. So Ashtaroth, as I said, I'd come up with this story, or the bare bones of it at least, like when I was quite young, so like 13, 14. And I'd always pictured the main character, Ashtaroth, as, this quite feminine, very pretty to an extent, I guess, but he's also kind of like thought not to be very attractive by like the people around him either. He's quite, sickly. He's considered sickly within his culture and stuff. And so he'd always had those characteristics, but I'd always pictured him as like a cis man. And when I was serializing the book later, and I'd started to revise it and that kind of thing, like I was like, oh, there's like some gender ambiguity here, maybe. Like this character, like maybe they're not entirely cis actually, like maybe there's something else going on. But I kind of like had this sense that I wanted it to be quite ambiguous. There's no sense in world and universe of like non-binary identities, so perhaps the character might be non-binary in like our own context, but in his own context, and I'm gonna say he because he uses he him in the story, but like he doesn't, you know, have the language for that, right? So there's not much of a sense of it. Now, when I started serializing it, there was this wonderful, actually, like one of my only readers, because like, you know, there were like two people were reading the story, one on one website and one on the other, and then my friend was also reading it. But you know, one of my readers, of my three readers, was this lovely trans woman who was like reading it very closely and very carefully, and she just had so many smart things to say about it that were much smarter than the book itself, to be honest. And like, you know, she saw immediately in Astaroth like a trans woman, like, and one of the things she commented very astutely one day was like, you know, this character, like, you know, I think that you know, she's great rep, you know, like more or less was what she said. But you know, the one thing is like she kind of falls into this trope of like, you know, a super femme presenting like trans woman who like would have no trouble passing, kind of a thing. You know, and it's not that those people don't exist, obviously, just the same as like there are tons of trans men who pass better or whatever, but it can be a dangerous, you know, trope if that's the predominant one. You know, so I thought that was a really smart comment. And but it had me reflecting a lot on like, and I'm repeating a lot of the stuff I said in that essay here, but like, it had me reflecting a lot on why I had chosen to make the character that way, and especially because those had always been features of the character. And I realized that the reason why I'd done it is because subconsciously I was kind of like, I always kind of had these really like pretty male characters, some of whom weren't very attractive, but were still like pretty, I guess. And then others that were sort of like these like Lothario type characters, which I still have a lot of. Like I always like these sort of like romantic dudes, like, you know, like 19th century sort of romantic Byron-esque figures. Like I like to play those kind of, yeah, I like to play those kind of characters in like the live action role play I have with my friends. You know, escape my short, stumpy kind of self, I guess. And like I think that's what it was, is that I had wrote like my trans maleness into this character. Like there's this character who doesn't feel comfortable in like the super femme body, you know, but like everybody recognizes that character as male. So it's like partly fantasy, like a wish fulfillment kind of fantasy in a way, but it's also kind of like, you know, these are my negative experiences of dysphoria as well that are sort of embodied in this character. So you know, I thought about because the series isn't, I haven't written the finished series yet. You know, so there was the possibility to be like, oh, maybe I'll come down more firmly on like Astaroth will actually be a trans woman. And I decided ultimately not to, because I felt like that was kind of dishonest in a way. You know, and there are trans women in the book as well, who, you know, identify as women. I always tend to write characters who are almost like at least one step removed from me. And I think that goes back kind of to something you were saying, Kris. Like, and like I've been told by friends before, usually like cisgender friends who were very well meaning, like, you know, like, do you think that's an internalized transphobia? Or like maybe you should actually try writing a trans character and stuff. And I always felt kind of uncomfortable by like about that. And I don't really know if I can articulate why. Like, maybe partly because part of me is like, oh, maybe that's true. Or, you know, part of me is just like, I don't like being told that by a cis person, like, because like these are the kinds of characters I want to write, and like I want to write my characters. But I always do tend to write characters that are at least one step removed identity wise from me. Again, maybe it's about exploring difference. Maybe it feels safer. I don't know. There's another character in the book, you know, named Oran, who is intersex, and kind of like, you know, I would say in a modern sense would identify as a trans man. I would think. So like I wrote there's like an interim short story about him that bridges the gap between sort of like the first book, The Wings of Astaroth, and the second book, The Crown of Asmodeus. Actually put a lot of like my own feelings as like a young trans man navigating my sexuality. And like at the time I was really like primarily attracted to women. I came into kind of my bisexuality like, you know, quite late in my late 20s, early 30s, which is something that's mirrored in Tyler and in the erstwhile Tyler Kyle. But, you know, like I put a lot of that into, I would say, Oran, and that was very intentional at that point. because I was like, okay, I think there's some things actually like I would like to say about transness. And part of the reason why I felt comfortable doing that was actually like talking to other trans men, even in just like brief little interactions online, because I hadn't really talked to a lot of other trans men before, to be honest. And like there were things that I had experienced and felt that I was just like, well, that's just how I feel, or that's just how, like this happened for me, or and I discovered like a lot of other trans men were frustrated about the exact same things I was frustrated by, in terms of like, how they were being represented. Like, I can't remember if it was you, Kris, or you, Connor, who was talking about like how a lot of like queer characters felt like they were playing it safe, or there was this sort of like I don't know, like they didn't feel real almost. And that's a complaint I have, yeah, still to this day. Like often is like I find like I'm a big Star Trek fan. I really like a lot of Star Trek Discovery, and I really liked some of the main characters in speaking of characters I identify with, I really liked Stamets in the first couple seasons. He's this sort of like stick in the mud kind of character engineer guy who's like really rigid, and like people are kind of scared of him. He has resting bitch face, and like I found him very like I identified with him very well. But then like as gradually as the series progressed, like they like kind of like declawed him, I guess is the way to put it. Like, but they made everyone just became really soft, and like no one had conflict, or if they had conflict, they all resolved it in like the most sort of like, I don't know, like psychologist like speak ever. It's just like this is not for me. Like this doesn't, they don't feel real anymore. They felt real before, and now they don't.
I feel like there's room for some sort of like safer sort of queer sort of narratives. I'm thinking of stuff like Heartstopper, I think is the name of it. Things like that.
Oh, you've heard of that.
Or it's like those kinds of narratives. There's a space for that, but that sometimes there's like stuff like that takes up about like 80% of the stuff that gets out there is like stuff in that nature, which can kind of make something that with more of a bite to it sort of feel it hits home a little bit because you're not getting as much of it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I definitely feel that. The like, if it's not too much to say another thing, is that okay?
Oh yeah,
go for it.
I don't know why I'm saying that, like I'm the authority here.
Open forum, like
cool. The other thing, like, that I very intentionally from quite early on, like when I was writing Astaroth, I specifically put a lot of my experiences around sort of my awkwardness around sex actually into the character of Astaroth. So like, Astaroth he's 20 years old, and like he kind of has the reaction to like, sexual proximity to people of somebody like a lot younger in a lot of ways, which is something the characters comment on. And like, he freezes, he gets really rigid, like he kind of he's attracted to people, he doesn't know what to do with it. Like, and like I had various experiences like, into my 20s where it was like, I'd go on a couple of dates with somebody, and then they would expect something, and then I'd get anxious, and like I didn't, want, it seemed really fast to me. Like if someone tried to initiate some kind of like situation like that, like I would literally have like the freeze response. Like I would turn into a block of wood. Like, like, and that I wrote that kind of very intentionally into Astaroth. Like he has this like quasi sort of flirtation with this really lovely woman who like, she really likes him and stuff. And like, he just doesn't know what to do basically. And like, he like eventually realizes like I don't want to be physically proximate to you, then later like regrets it and stuff, and like once maybe he can't be with her, he's suddenly like, oh no, I did want to like get with her actually. And like that was based on like my own experience that I had with somebody actually. So like, it's challenging, I think, that too. Like I've never like I hedge around using any labels to describe myself as like asexual or using asexuality, because like never quite felt like that fit me particularly. I had sexual experiences with people, but mostly people I was like really, really close to already. It was always that. Like in any attempt, like other kind of situation, it was like I would do the same thing. It would just be like complete, like rigid block of wood, bad times, and like this is probably why I never dated anyone officially for a really long time. Also,
That makes sense.
yeah. So like when I'm describing the book to other people in terms of like things like rap, I usually say like, well, like it has asexuality in it because it seems like I feel like that is a lot of people's experience who do identify as asexual. I guess I just like I'm very allergic to labels generally, so like I'm hesitant to apply things like that to myself, but um I think it's there in the book, and that was very intentional kind of on my part. Was like, I want to write about that experience and kind of what that feels like, and just yeah, kind of like probe that a little bit, and the kind of messiness it creates too, because like especially if you're not very emotionally mature, sorry, you don't really necessarily know how to deal with like your own feelings about it, the guilt you might feel, or also like the fact that maybe you're not communicating with other people very clearly about like the fact that you're feeling these things. So I thought that was kind of important to kind of show a little bit in this kind of quasi immature, somewhat entitled character as well.
I like that.
And The Wings of Astaroth is such a beast of a book as well. There's a lot of unpacking.
Yes.
How many words is it?
How many pages is it?
I think it's over 1,000 pages on the ebook. It's like 429K, I think. Yeah.
Jesus.
Is the second book roughly
Man.
a similar size? Or are they just going to be chunks for the
It's
series?
it's only partly written. I've written like about 120K, 22K, I think of it.
How did you get that to fit in like a paperback?
I don't have a physical book out. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I was man. I was
Yeah.
about to be very impressed. The longest I've ever seen an indie author put into like a physical format was I think 390K. And that was like
Right.
1,200 pages. It was
Is
crazy.
that Ryan Cahill? I feel like he's got some super big
I
books.
think it might have been Crystal Matar.
Yeah,
I forget specifically
Legacy of the Bright Watch
how
is
long that
quite
one was.
long, isn't it? Yeah.
Mm.
It doesn't feel long though when you're reading it. I'm reading it now and it's so
Oh
good.
yeah. My
So
favorite
good.
books are the ones that they're huge and
Yeah.
everyone's talking about like, oh my god, it's huge, it must take forever to read, and then you read it and it's like the most page turning thing you've ever
Yeah.
read, and you get it done in like a week. That's always
Yeah.
my favorite thing.
Same. And that's like I try to like hope that people will find Astaroth that way, but so far like it's been really hard to convince people to read my book. Like but
You gotta like you gotta like lie to them in some way, like convince them it's actually super short, and
yes.
then you gotta trick them to get them through the door, and then by the time they're reading it, they're like, shouldn't I be halfway by now? And then they see a little percentage, and they're like, oh, well that
Yeah.
one's ripped already, so it's too
Yeah.
late.
Tom
When I
Mott
get
was
through my
suggesting.
Malazan journey, I'll start
Oh
reading
yeah.
those big
Yes.
books.
Yeah. Yeah.
Every time you click that Kindle and you're reading Malazan, it's like 1%. You've been there for 2 hours. Like, how?
Oh
Yeah.
no.
How am I still
Oh
here?
god.
Yeah. It's rough.
Well, coming out of, I guess, sort of book things and talking more general experience as we sort of come to the end of the discussion is I feel like the world is becoming both more open and more closed minded about gender and sexual expression. There are people who are, and I talk about the US, I suppose, because that's sort of where I'm plugged into, and Australia, who is just basically America's bitch at this point, is like, we're seeing so much progress for young people coming out and identifying on the rainbow somewhere. But at the same time, there seems to be this resistance from like the opposite end. So it is becoming both more open and more closed-minded. What keeps you both moving forward in your own journeys?
I don't think I wrote an answer for this one.
I was going to say, we'll start with you, Connor, and then go up to Steve.
I mean, I can
No
do
pressure.
it. I can throw something off straight off the dome. Let's see if I can do this. All right. Okay, it's probably more inertia than anything else, honestly. It's just I'm already going in that direction. So it's like, and it's sort of any like sort of revelation I have about myself sort of like inherently kills my sort of previous sense of self-perception. So at a certain point, sort of like taking a step back on that journey would be like trying to reanimate the previous phoenix by like sifting through the ashes. Like, come on, it's in here somewhere. Like, no, it's not. It's ashes. It's too late now. You've already done the thing. Like that's not how immolation works, you know. That version of me doesn't fit together the way that it used to anymore. Sometimes I will move like sideways. I've gone from like identifying with like I oscillate between how to what extent I identify with non-binary identity and things like that, or even bisexual identity. Is sort of like I'm more attracted to sort of like femininity than specifically like any particular gender, you know. So it's like I go back and forth on a lot of that, but I'm not necessarily taking the huge step back of like I'm not gonna like go back into the closet anytime soon, or I'm not gonna like pretend to be something I'm not after I've already had this revelation about myself. It would feel like wearing like a costume, you know?
My mum asked me for a loyalty card if I came out again.
Oh, she's so close to the coupon.
Yeah. Like, what do you want? Like, what do you want to win? She didn't have an answer for that one.
She gets like a free rainbow flag, right?
Something like that.
Yeah.
I think I like took this question in a much darker way.
Oh, no.
Well, I like how do you keep going in the world, basically, like and I just wrote, is it possible to not move forward? To which there's like probably an obvious answer, and that is possible. But to get too like dark. But I think like, you know, that is part of it. Like, you know, you just kind of keep going and you deal with, you know, the things that are happening. And like to some extent, I think seeing everything that's happening, it's quite destabilizing and overwhelming. I have noticed like, and partly I actually think it's like being on testosterone. Like I've become a bit more nonchalant about it in a way, but I don't think in a bad way. I think I've just like become like, because I like am a very anxious person. I have anxiety. Like I'll get really fixated on something, like, you know, like if my mind, if for a moment I don't feel anxious, my brain will literally stop and be like, there's something you're supposed to be anxious about that you've forgotten. Like think about it until you remember it, and it's like, oh yes, global warming, we're all dying, okay. And then like you can move on.
Oh man.
And like, you know, I'll still like do that a bit, but not as much. And so I suspect that's kind of a hormonal thing, but it might also be that I started taking edibles. So,
that will also do it for you, yeah.
Yeah. So it could be that too, but I don't think it's a bad thing anyway. But you know, I think like part of it too is like increasingly I see the importance of being like to keep going out of spite, and you know, like thinking about the fact that the people literally do want you to be silent. Like that is the goal, is to make you shut up about stuff, is to make you stop talking, is like you know, to get you to kind of like sink into this malaise where it's just like, yeah, actually I am just going to sit there and mindlessly watch Netflix for hours and like, you know, buy my nerdy toys online and, you know, engage in capitalist, you know, bullshittery. You know, which of course I still also do. I still like binge watch crappy reality shows all the time, especially when I've had some edibles. But you know,
that makes the experience so much smoother.
Yeah, I sit on my bed doing like my partner actually on Friday nights, like every Friday night plays this like live role play with his sisters. They play Smash Brothers and they role play their characters while doing this, and they're really loud. So I go in the bedroom and I have an edible and I do my puzzle, which gets much harder as like time progresses, and like put on like Love Is Blind or some shit on the computer. Like that's what I do on Friday nights.
Oh, that's perfect.
Yeah. Yeah, it's quite fun. Like there was one point where like I was like, I'm doing this puzzle really well, and I like when the next morning when I went to look, I was like, I put so much of the puzzle together and opened it up, and like all I'd done was taken all the pieces of the puzzle that weren't put together and put them in the center of the puzzle, and it's like now I can't do the puzzle because it's full of all the pieces. Like anyway,
oh, that's the most edible shit I've ever heard.
Yeah. So anyway, but
So the solution is edibles, right? That's what I'm getting from this. Have you tried edibles? That keeps you moving forward.
Yes. At a slow pace.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I do think kind of spite, and also just like seeing young people, seeing that there's other people, other and like animals, like the world is depending on us not to be quiet and not to shut up about things. And so I think there's a degree to which kind of like seeing that and witnessing that, like you have to do something. Like, we can't always be doing things all the time, of course. Like burnout is a really big problem that I've especially been dealing with lately. But like, need to do something. Use what you're able to within your means to do something. Spread the word, whatever it is. Just keep saying shit. Yeah.
Mine was like the complete opposite of what if we just stop? And it's like,
oh no,
the world will not stop, therefore we cannot stop. Like something is always going to be happening, something is always going to be progressing. What is our intent behind how we react to those changes, and how do we react with intention for ourselves? And this will bleed into like the last question that I have here, so I won't go too much into it. But what is selfishness, and is that something that is just for us, or is it for other people? My initial response to this question was, I'm just too old to give a shit anymore, so I'm going to keep going on my journey.
How do you do that? Do you have any advice?
For me. Testosterone. Started like when Steve
right.
He said
I'll get right on that.
Nonchalant. I was like, I stopped feeling anything on testosterone. Just the emotions just left. Not that I was overly emotional to begin with. I have not gone through the autistic testing. I'm looking into it, but I suspect I'm somewhere on the Asperger's spectrum. Personally, sense. But it's like I finally feel like I'm in the body and I'm in the personality that I've always been, and I just refuse to not be that anymore. And I refuse to not be open to questions about it. So I'm now at the point where being queer and being trans is no longer my whole identity, even though it felt that way for a long time. So if anyone needs help along that journey, the door is always open. And still having people find my old account on YouTube, it's still up, it's still live for that reason. Even though I'm not comfortable with how I looked and presented at the beginning of it, it's important for me to have that there so that people can find me. I have a personal Instagram account. I still get messages on there from young trans people, from trans people who are discovering themselves in their 30s, 40s, 50s and starting to ask those questions. And that's why I keep going. Is because there is always someone's hand to hold, and if I can be that hand for that time, that's all that matters for me and that person on that journey. So, with the philosophical stuff sort of coming to the conclusion, the last question I have for everyone here is, if there is one piece of advice you can give to anyone questioning not even necessarily queerness or transness, but a fundamental part of their identity, regardless of age, what would that piece of advice be? We'll start with Steve and go around.
Yeah, so I wrote a pretty like coherent answer for this one, actually, that I ended up quite liking, because I was like, this is going to be one of those questions where, Kris asked me to pick one book, and I picked 5 books, and then talked about 6 books. So I'll just say this. So I wrote, be patient with yourself, and don't be pressured into, I already can't read my writing, into remaining in any kind of box. Those kinds of terms for identity can be useful, but they should always be tools, not cages. So I think a lot of the time, like, we do face a lot of pressure to, be X, or you're Y, and that means you can't, think this thing or feel that way. And I think, we've lost track of the fact that, we come up with these terms. They're all invented terms and ideas to describe something that we're feeling or experiencing. And yes, they can be very useful for us in order to do that, to be able to articulate your identity, to be able to find or foster a community around an identity. But at the point where something starts to be anything that you need to live up to and that is making you feel like you're a failure in some way, like that's the point at which the term isn't useful anymore, right? So if we're beating each other over the heads with like, well, you're not, performing bisexuality right, or you're not being, a correct trans woman, or like, you have to tick all of these boxes to be an asexual, like, these kinds of things can be really damaging for people. And especially when, like our identity can fluctuate, and I think everyone's identities inherently fluctuate throughout their lives. So just be patient with yourself and be patient with others. And maybe you find a particular identity or a label of some kind really useful, so use it while it is useful, but don't let it sort of dictate who you are. Make sure you're the one dictating the terms, not the other way around.
That one's really good, honestly. I think a lot of the stuff I'm going to end up saying is probably going to be very similar. The biggest advice is stop giving a shit. Stop. Whatever you're going to like, this is very hypocritical coming from me, who gives so many fucks all of the time. But seriously, just for wherever you are, just own it. I When I first got to this community in 2021, I was trying very hard to sort of embody this sort of classical idea of like a stereotypical muscular man, wearing like tight shirts with very defined biceps and things like that. And then the more I started sort of questioning that, the more it was just sort of like changing up like how I perceive myself, and then trying to reflect that in the way I present myself. And at every point, I've tried to just fully commit to, for wherever I'm at, just commit to it, regardless of if some, like, people are going to think I'm a piece of shit, regardless of what I do. So I might as well commit to what is going to be. I'm still going to feel weird about it. I'm still going to have like second thoughts and doubts, but just do it anyway. Like it's like, there's like some old meme I remember being like, if it's scary, then just like do it scared. It's like that. It's difficult to tell someone to just stop caring about things. But it's like, if you do, then just like don't let that rule you. And I think the other thing that can be important, especially if you're reconsidering your identity, is I feel like can be important to sort of find some sort of testable sort of part of yourself that's like immutable, that's not going like it's something you can go into the world and test as like a core aspect of who you are, that is not going to change if your sexual identity, your gender identity, whatever sort of neurodivergence you have, like that's still going to be a part of you. That is something that you're going to be able to cling to regardless of what circumstances you're in. It's like the personal thing that I tend to cling to is like the kind of person I try to be is the person who's like ease fear and reduce suffering in any sort of like if it is possible for me to do that sort of thing. And that kind of thing can be very important to cling to, as if you're going through sort of like a shakeup of your entire identity. And yeah, if I could boil this down into one sentence, I'd be like, stop apologizing. Basically, stop apologizing. Just own who you are for wherever it's going to be. It might not stick, but like, don't apologize for wherever you're at. Just stop it.
Good piece of advice. I was looking at this question for a long time last night, and sitting around the whole "it gets better" thing, but then wanting to go deeper than that surface level, like as someone who has now done this and has come out relatively unscathed on the other side, like regardless of how hard those first few years felt, now identify this way. So for me, it really boils down to give yourself permission to be selfish. Regardless of what journey you're on, if you are questioning a fundamental part of who you are, you have to let yourself feel what you're feeling and give yourself permission to do that. Sit and reflect on it, because this journey is inherently selfish, but it has to be. It has to be. This is you, and it's your time, and your loved ones, and I mean the people who really love you, will be there. They will be there at the end of this. on your journey and they will see you through it. So make sure you take your time with the journey, feel the pain because it is painful, feel the joy where you can take it, and just know that this is going to feel like the longest fucking period of your life. It really, really does. But you will get through it. Let yourself be selfish and let yourself feel it the whole way through, because you will come out the other side. Is my one piece of advice.
Yeah.
All right, so that was Queer Corner, episode 4. Thank you so much to Steve and Connor for joining me on this journey. Hopefully this means that these episodes will be back a little bit more frequently when I can pull my finger out and write some questions down for people. But thank you both for joining me today and talking about exploring identities through escapism and our journeys.
Thank you
Thanks
for having us
on.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, as always,
yeah, we'll
Sorry,
find out
Steve?
if we brought the chaos, because that was the promise.
I forgot
I feel
about
like
that,
this was
yeah.
relatively tame.
Yeah, well, I was
It
about to
was
say
pretty
that
chill.
we all talked about how like we like characters who were like have sticks up their asses, and
Oh yeah,
like,
there's that. Yeah. Oh no, yeah, you
and
know,
so it's like
yeah.
it's like, are we really actually chaotic, or like do we just like in
Like
our
very
minds it's
controlled,
chaotic?
chill chaos, you know?
Yeah.
Like the world's on fire and you're just eating an edible.
Yeah, there we go.
Watching Love is Blind doing a puzzle in the background.
Yes,
exactly.
doing a puzzle.
That can be its own form of chaos,
Yeah,
depending
there
on
we
what's
go.
happening, like
Yes.
adjacent to that.
Yeah.
All right, well, we will sign off. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and we'll see you in the next video.
Bye.
Ciao.